We're not certain at the age of Solomon, when he entered into the office of kingship, when he accessed the throne. Some writers suggest that he was as young as 12 years old. For example, Eusebius, a 4th century writer, quotes another writer to suggest that he was actually only 12. Josephus tells us that he thinks that Solomon was 15 years old when he first came to the throne. However, if we were to take the data in the Old Testament, which we do, such as 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 21, which tells us that he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem, plus the fact that his son Rehoboam reigned for 41 years, that means that Rehoboam, that is his successor, that means that Rehoboam was already born when Solomon became king, which precludes the idea that he was a teenager. He surely was not anything less than 21 years old. However, the text of 1 Kings chapter 3, which shows us that Solomon goes to Gibeon and prays to God for guidance and wisdom, shows us in his own statement that he was, as he puts it, young and tender, or he was a very young man. According to the Jews, the Hebrews, they believed that anyone who was in their, all the way up to 30 years old, in their 20s even, was young and tender, a very young person. And so Solomon did not feel equipped, whatever the age was, he did not feel equipped to deal with the people, to be as a king as he should be. Consequently, his first act of business was to go to a place called Gibeon. And there he offered a holocaust that would be 1,000 sacrifices, whole sacrifices, burnt offerings. Holocaust is the word for actually whole burnt offering. And he offered 1,000 animals and sacrificed to God, thanking God for bringing him to the throne, as well as praying to God for guidance. And so let's pick up Solomon's trip to Gibeon. Is where the chapter opens in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. There are a couple of passages here. One of them is in verse 2 and verse 3, and then the other one is in verse 4. And it tells us that Gibeon was the principal, or as the chief high place in all of Israel, the principal high place. Not only so, but we are told, informed, that Solomon himself was one who loved Jehovah, and he walked after his statutes and commandments only, that is, except that he offered and sacrificed in the high places. So let's think about the high places, generally speaking, and specifically Gibeon. Why go to Gibeon? And why was it the principal high place? And what were these high places? How did they come about? So we need to back up in Israelite history and note what God had to say about it, as well as what happened as the Israelites came over the Jordan River. The Canaanite people who lived in the land, pagan people to be sure, worshipped at what were called high places. They were simply prominent hills in all of the territory where they offered to the false gods. They would build altars there, they would have shrines, and they would worship at the high places. Consequently, God told them when they came over the Jordan River, as they went in, they were to exterminate the high places, and they were not to worship God in the high places, as was the temptation to do. That was God's command. As a matter of fact, he put it very bluntly in Deuteronomy chapter 12. They were to worship only where I place my name, that is, where I have authorized them to worship. The tabernacle, that would be a location where the worship of God was to be conducted. It was, of course, for a couple of reasons, perhaps, that we might note this. As one writer put it, because they would worship in the high places, or perhaps it would be the case at least, that they would be tempted, number one, to incorporate some of the idolatry and idolatrous practices into their own worship, which absolutely is indeed what took place through the years. Not only so, but God wanted a centralized location for worship. He wanted a centralized government, a centralized place of worship for cohesion among the people. And consequently, God said they are to worship God where I place my name. That they did not do this faithfully, we can only account to the fact that these were the times of ignorance that God overlooked. But now he commands men everywhere to repent, according to Acts chapter 17, verse 30. Times of ignorance that God overlooked. Consequently, the statement is made in 1 Kings 3 and 3 that Solomon worshiped in the high places. He was faithful to God, but except that, only that, he worshiped in the high places. When the tabernacle first came into the land of Israel, it was located at a small place called Shiloh. That's where all of the Israelites were to gather to worship. It was, remember, the tent of meeting, surrounded by a courtyard. They had an altar of worship there, a brazen altar of sacrifice. And remember the pieces of furniture that were in the tabernacle, and that was located at Shiloh. Something occurred along the lines of warfare that caused them to move it to a place called Nob, N-O-B. When David was fleeing from King Saul, the tabernacle was located at Nob. David, remember, came to Nob and was given the sacrifice, or rather the showbread, from the tabernacle for himself and his warriors to eat. They were famished, and so they gave them the showbread, but that was at Nob. But then finally, David wanted to make a place, a centralized location, apparently with God's approval, where the temple would be built. He wanted to build a permanent place. David himself was disallowed from building the permanent temple, but he wanted to bring the tabernacle to Jerusalem. However, he did not pay attention to God's order on the transportation of the tabernacle and its pieces of furniture. And you recall that Uzzah reached forth his hand to the ark, touched it, and he died. And that was at a place nearby Gibeon, at the house of Obed-Edom, where the tabernacle was at that time now situated. And the ark stayed there until David found instruction on how to bring the ark to Jerusalem. One of the fascinating elements of it is that the Ark of the Covenant actually had been brought later by David into the town of Jerusalem and was set at Mount Moriah, the hill upon which the temple would be built. Apparently there was a small tabernacle surrounding it, as well as a brazen altar that they would sacrifice upon. We saw that last week when Joab went to the tabernacle in Jerusalem, grabbed the horns of the altar for seeking asylum. However, the original tabernacle still was located in Gibeon. Gibeon is not to be confused, incidentally, with Gibeah. Gibeah is where Saul first initiated the kingdom, where Saul was from. Both of them, confusing enough, are in the tribes of Benjamin, that tribal territory of Benjamin. But Gibeon was only a few miles north of Jerusalem, and it was called the principal or the chief high place. That is, a place where they worshiped God. Consequently, Saul, at the initiation of his kingdom, goes to Gibeon, and he wants to seek guidance from God on how to direct the people in the way they should go. So Solomon goes to Gibeon and there offers the sacrifices and prays to God for guidance. It is interesting to note, as we pass along the way, that God has always ordered his worship a certain way and to be done a certain methodology. The same thing is true in the New Testament. According to John chapter 4, however we read it, however we interpret the words here, they that worship God must worship in spirit and truth. That is to say that there is a methodology that God demands in worship, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament as well. And it behooves man to discover what method God demands and desires of us to worship. And they had neglected some of that. Consequently, the tabernacle was still located at Gibeon. So here goes Solomon to Gibeon in order to seek God's guidance, and offers 1,000 burnt offerings on a sacrificial altar. It's interesting here that Solomon here falls into a sleep, and God speaks to him in a dream. And he asks Solomon, "Ask me what I will give you. What do you want from me?" And Solomon answers the question in a proper and appropriate fashion, as we will see in a moment. That brings to mind something that we need to note, and that is, during the Old Testament period, there were 3 modes of communication by which God communicated to man. 3 modes. Number 1 was the prophetic mode, that is, speaking by the mouth of a prophet. For example, we have the statement made by David, 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 2, where the Lord spake by me, and his word was upon my tongue. The very words of the prophet, or the prophets, these are the guidance of God. And they wrote them down, and these words are that which guided the people. So the prophetic word, speaking through individuals, not every individual, but certain selected few. Number two, the method was by what was called the Urem and the Thume. Or we sometimes call it the Urem and Thummim, but I think in the Hebrew they would say Urem and Thummim. And that would be, well, what is the Urem and Thummim? Those were actually lots that were kept behind the jeweled breastplate of the high priest. And they would ask God a question. David, for example, frequently asked by means of the Urem what he should do when he's fleeing from King Saul. Where should he go? How should he approach the battle? And he would ask, and he would call the priest, the high priest, and he would ask God the question, and God would show by the lot that was given, that is, from behind the breastplate of the priest, and he would show the answer to it. It is interesting that during the time of Solomon, this apparently came into disuse, because we don't find one single instance, at least I have not been able to discover it, of Solomon or anyone thereafter ever consulting the Urem or the Thummim as far as guidance to God is concerned, from God is concerned. So it was now fallen into disuse. And we don't see any prophetic word in the time of Solomon either as we go along the way. We see the prophetic word that is speaking by the prophets only in Solomon's later years after he had apostatized. The third method of communication was means of dreams. That is, that God would select an individual and speak by means of a dream and communicate that way. It's important for us to see that in the days when there was not a finished, completed canon of Scripture, that God selected individuals and would reveal his will to them, and they would then in turn reveal it to others. That's exactly what happened here in the case with Solomon. As he is sleeping, God asked him the question, ask me what I will, or what you will, and I will give it you. It's a remarkable statement, isn't it? Incidentally, thinking about the dreams, it is very similar to what people think about today when, well, the Holy Spirit tells me this, or the Holy Spirit told me that, or I have a feeling I should do this, the Spirit moves me here and there. Jeremiah addressed all of that, by the way, many years later in Jeremiah chapter 23, wherein the people would say, one person then another, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. Sounds like some famous speech, doesn't it? But I have a dream, and these dreams are those by which we're guided. And Jeremiah would come back with the answer. He says, you are speaking out of your own heart. You have not been revealed anything by God. And that's exactly the way people are today. That is to say, well, the Spirit tells me to do this. Spirit tells me to do that. I can hear Jeremiah in the background saying, no, this is your own idea, and you're interpreting it as a movement of the Spirit. But that was, of course, liable to abuse, therefore. That is, revealing by dreams. But be that as it may, Solomon was revealed in the dream, what shall I give you? I want to stop here also and answer this question. Does he reveal himself to us that way? Well, not today specifically by means of dreams, but there is that same open-ended question for us today. Ask me what I will or what you will, and I will give it you. Malachi tells us in chapter 3 and verse 11, he says that if you will ask, test me, put me to the test, I will open the windows of heaven and pour out the blessings upon you. God was pleased with Solomon because he did not ask for, number one, a long life. He did not ask for riches, material wealth. He did not ask for victory over his enemies. Instead, he asked for wisdom and understanding in order that I might guide this people. Now, we might stop for a moment and think about our own selves and what our desires are and what our requests of God may be. And you know what they are. in your own heart. I hear many parents, for example, advising their children in certain directions as far as occupations or schools in life, as far as where they should go and what they should do and how they should labor, as the basic idea is, how much money will I make? How much money will you make? How much money will be had in that occupation versus this occupation? Have you ever heard parents do that? A lot of people in the church talk that way. That shows us where our priorities actually are. We may say, well, I want wisdom from God, an understanding heart. But at the bottom line, too frequently, we're about material possessions, material wealth. And that's how we guide our children. But Solomon pleased God in the fact that he didn't ask for any of these things. He didn't ask for a long life. He didn't ask for material possessions. He did not ask for victory over his enemies. Instead, he asked for an understanding and wise heart, because I am a child and I need to guide this people. What a great, mature request with which God was pleased. And because of that, God blessed him with all the others as well. And he gave him a long life, but it was conditional upon keeping the ordinances and the statutes that your David your father has also kept. My commandments, all depended upon how Solomon would be faithful to God. So let's think about Solomon's wisdom for just a moment. And I have it divided up into 3 different types of wisdom. Let's just stop for a moment and let's survey the entire ground about wisdom. We live in an age of anxiety. I don't think that perhaps we have more to be anxious about than our forefathers have been, or foremothers. Surely we don't have more anxiety and more things about which we should be anxious. But this is an anxious age, isn't it? One of the teachers at school the other day gave me a DSM manual, the latest DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, about that thick. That is, these are all the disorders, supposed, that we have in our soul and with which counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists are going to help us. It's amazing to think that it grows, and it grows seemingly exponentially all the time. More and more problems, extending on and on. And we live in an age of anxiety. People are so anxious about everything. But the truth is that God has already given us the real DSM manual, and it's right here in the Bible. He's already given us all that we need to know. Now, this is not to say that there is no place for any kind of medication, period. But it is to say that we are an over-medicated people, and we're an over-anxious people, and we're not finding our way very clearly as Americans any longer. It's just not happening. And the prime reason is because as a culture we have lost faith in God and our fellow man. Our faith in God, by that I mean our trust in God, guiding us in every step of the way, along the way, and faith in our fellow man. We've lost that as Americans. And we need to be people who redouble our efforts to stay with what God has guided us to say and to do. I read several years ago about a NASA scientist. I thought this was interesting, ironic, really. A NASA scientist who said that the reason we want to explore the heavens and go to other planets and the stars and find out different things in the heavens is because, now listen to this, it will help us to solve social problems in America and on the globe, and help us to solve the environmental crisis. Amazing, isn't it? Help us to solve the social problems. The amazing and ironic thing is that here we have scientists reaching to heaven to find the answers. And heaven is already answered. And it comes to us through the words of Solomon. And he has 3 marvelous books that he pieces together for you to explain to you all the vicissitudes of life and all of the choices that you're going to be faced with and how you should order your life. So look at these 3 volumes. We'll just do it in brief. Proverbs, and then Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Proverbs are those proverbial sayings, wise ideas and concepts by which we should guide our lives. He tells us, for example, in chapter 1 and verse 7, one of my favorites of Proverbs is, the fear of the Lord. That means the reverence to God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. In biblical terminology, in Solomon's wording, the fool is the one operating without God. And that could apply to members of the Lord's church who order their lives and make their decisions based upon what is surrounding them in the physical world, little recourse, I should say, to God. That's the fool. And he tells us that the beginning of wisdom, the initiating point, the very beginning of it, is respect for Almighty God. Now we see immediately where our culture has absolutely collapsed, haven't we? Because we are not wise people any longer as an American society. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Here's something else that comes out in that text, and he tells you that most people are going to go in another direction. There are going to be many people who fall into what are called the fool's category, going the opposite way. And so you must gird up your loins, decide to go against the grain, upstream, and follow God's guidance. That's Proverbs 1 and 7. He tells us in Proverbs 5, 6, and 7, the dangers facing a young man. And that is thinking about the sexual temptations. 5, 6, and 7. You might think of it this way. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 is the initiating book that a young man and a young woman need to read as far as going out into the world to guard against the sexual temptations that are there. And all of this Solomon has in the book of Proverbs, much more as well. Then the book of Ecclesiastes. What a fascinating book is this. Ecclesiastes was Solomon's experimentation with all of these things in life and all those things that supposedly make you happy. Isn't that what we want? We want happiness. That's what everybody says they want. They want to be happy. Solomon says, here's how you do it. I tried it this way. I tried it that way. I tried it 1, 2, 3, and he tells all these different methods by which he tried to find happiness. And what does he conclude? Fear God. Keep his commandments. This is the whole of man. You want to be happy, respect God. You know, learning begins with respect. Why are we not seeing much learning in the public education system any longer? No respect, or very little respect. And there's not hardly any of it in many classrooms any longer. No respect. And you cannot learn. You cannot begin to learn. You can't look like you want to learn if you have no respect for those around you, for those who are your elders and those who are your peers. And that's exactly where we are, falling down. But Ecclesiastes talks about all of this and more also. And then the Song of Solomon is a great book speaking about a love between husband and wife and how the physical relationship should work and how the relationship as a whole should continue to operate and be pleasing to God. And those are the books of Solomon. Now, Solomon's material, as you can see, is apropos for today. I don't like when people say, well, that's in the Old Testament. Yes, it is. But it's not part of the law that was done away. This is exactly the manual that we need today in order to guide our lives and to be happy. And the reason that people are not happy is because we've not followed Solomon's advice. Before we move on, let's just think about some of the specifics of it. Just breaking down all three books here for a moment. He tells you, for example, how can you become wise? Have you ever wondered about that? It's not about knowledge. It's not about just gaining knowledge and understanding about particular subjects. It's not about scientific knowledge. It's about wisdom. How do you gain wisdom? Solomon tells you how to be wise. It goes, and here's the hint, it goes into your action. It goes into how you behave, how you become wise. He tells you about the folly of sin. What is a what is a fool's errand? We'll learn about it with Solomon's words. And he tells us all about what is folly, the mistakes that are made. And here's the interesting thing. He tells us about sin. I beg people to look at Solomon's works to tell you, he gives you an anatomy of sin. How does sin work? What happens? What happens? And if you speak about, for example, think about adultery. How adultery changes a person's heart. It changes the way a person thinks. It changes their perspectives. It changes the way they desire certain things and eschew other things. It changes the way they try to justify things. Everything changes with sin. Sin works on your mind, and it causes you to fool yourself. And Solomon explains it all to you, how sin enters into the heart and begins to change, alter who you are. And that's exactly what he does. Solomon tells you how to be a good parent. And boy, isn't this needed today. Not Dr. Spock, not Karl Marx, and not people like that, not John Dewey in the education. He says, here's how you need to be educated, and here's how you need to train your children, and here's what needs to be done. And if we had stayed with that in our society, we'd be a lot better off. Thinking about that society, he tells you, what are the dangers and folly of a welfare society? Have you thought about that? He tells you the dangers of a welfare state. We live in a welfare state, by the way. We live in a welfare society. Would that our leaders would have given heed to Solomon's advice rather than John Dewey and others and Karl Marx instead of Solomon. We would not be in the fix we're in, because it deteriorates a person's spirit. It deteriorates their own dignity. And Solomon tells you all about it. The churches are always plagued with the question, for whom should the church care? Who should I help? Who should I not help? Solomon goes all the way through all of this material with you and tells you how you should spend your money and assist others. Speaking about money, he tells you how to manage your finances. Isn't that great? He tells you how to manage your checkbook, how to manage your finances at home, what you should do, what you should not do. And even deeper than that, he says, here's how you should manage, you ready for this? Your feelings. Manage your feelings. Now, we have a hard time with that. We think, no. I read a book several years ago, and it was about a psychotherapist, and he basically, and he didn't word it this way, but it was like, a person is like a steam engine, and, things build up, and pretty soon, the valve has to pop off, that's your mouth, and you have to say it, you have to get it out, and you have to. No, Solomon tells you, no, that's false. No, you're not a steam engine that builds pressure like that. No, he says, instead, here's how you manage your feelings. Here's what you're to do. I want you to do it this way. And when you do, you can conquer your feelings. You're stronger than a mighty captain of an army, because it's a hard thing to do. He tells you how to manage your language, what to say, what not to say, how to handle relationships with other people, what you should be about, and how to be a friend and how not to be a friend, and what kind of words you should use and what kind of words you should not use. Sounds pretty practical, doesn't it? All of that's right here in Solomon's advice. He said, here's how I want you to do it. Incidentally, he tells us the value of work. The value of work. Work is a valuable thing. It gives a person, as we mentioned a moment ago, what's that word? Dignity. It gives you dignity. If you make little or make a lot, it gives you dignity. Work with your hands. You're producing something. And private property, that which your work contributes toward. And he tells you the value of work. Therefore, when we have a society that pays people not to work, we're paying for trouble. And that's exactly what he tells us. Don't do it that way. On an offshoot note, our founding fathers of our country all recognized biblical injunctions and biblical advice, particularly King Solomon's advice. And they themselves, they said, well, no, this is why we don't ever want to have a welfare state. And they made it unconstitutional in our system to have a welfare system, period. They made it unconstitutional. It's against the law. Now, you people are, what? Yeah, we're absolutely way off. They said, well, here's why. And they went back to the Bible to explain why. It's interesting, isn't it? All of that and more also, Solomon gives you advice pertaining thereto. All very practical. Let's think about those three types of wisdom. If we're going to categorize it all and summarize it, let's think about these three areas. Number one is practical. The practical, that is, Solomon shows us what is the mainspring of human action. And he shows it in an illustration that comes before us in 1 Kings chapter 3. What happens in chapter 3? In chapter 3, there were two women, and both of them harlots. Both of them had children, apparently lived together. And having children, these small babies, one of the women rolled over on hers in the night, smothered the baby, and unbeknownst to the other woman in the house, she traded children with them. When the woman that had the live child woke up and found her child was dead, recognizing it was not her own, the case finally came before King Solomon. What did Solomon do? Well, both of them said it was one word against the other, your word and your word, but Solomon was able to peer into the springs of human action and human emotion. He said, bring me a sword. We're going to cut the baby in two. We'll give each half. And one of the women said, that's right. That's just and fair. The other woman pled for the life of the baby, and he recognized that was the mother. And his fame went out all over the entire Eastern world because of his great insight, practical wisdom. And he gives us all of these practical pieces of advice all through his books. Not only so, but we have, number two, the intellectual wisdom. Intellectual wisdom, we are told that Solomon, we would call it scientific, but really it's not science as we know it, but he spoke of the cedars of Lebanon, the hyssop that grows on the wall. He speaks about all the plants, but he uses all of these things and the animals and their character and the behavior to illustrate human behavior and human action and what it ought to be. And he was able to explain all of these things. So famed was he in his scientific or intellectual knowledge that they came from near and far to question him on the Queen of Sheba came and said, I've heard about his wisdom, and came and questioned him with many riddles, and he was able to answer them all. And she said, the half has not been told me. We're told that there were other famed wise men of the East. Solomon surpassed all of them. That's chapter 4, later part of the chapter. And not only intellectual wisdom, we have practical, intellectual, but you know what? There's the third one, and this is probably the most important. And what is it? It's godly and moral wisdom. Morality, moral base. Fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole of man. This really is the summation of it. And what I want to do is I want to look at a passage in Job chapter 28. You might turn in your text to Job 28 for just a moment. Because Job has, even though this is not Solomon's writing, he has really a summary statement of wisdom. This is Job 28, beginning in verse 12. Where shall wisdom be found, and where's the place of understanding? That is, where are we going to discover the principles of understanding? Isn't that what we need, the principles by which to make decisions? He's not going to give you every decision to make, but he's going to give you principles by which to make those decisions. Just like our Constitution is a gathering together of principles, and if you know the principles, then all of the incidental details in life become very simple to see and to assess. That's exactly what Solomon does. He gives us the principles. But where are they to be found? Man knows not the price of it, is not able to meet the price, neither is it found in the land of the living. No, that is no human ingenuity that can come up with the wisdom principles. The ocean depths say, it's not in me. The sea says, it's not with me. It can't be purchased with gold. Neither shall silver be weighed for the price of it. Remember we talked about in class weighing of silver. It cannot be valued with the gold of Ophir, with the precious onyx or the sapphire. Gold and glass cannot equal it. neither shall it be exchanged for jewels of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or of crystal. Yes, the price of wisdom is far above rubies. The topaz of Ethiopia shall not equal to it, neither shall it be valued with pure gold. Whence then comes wisdom? That is, where does it come from? Where's the place of understanding? Where are you going to get it? Seeing it is hid from the eyes of all the living, kept close from the birds of the heavens, that is, even birds flying above, they can't find it. But if we come down to verse 28, here's where it is. Unto man he saith. When he says, he saith, that means it comes from objective revelation. He says, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is, honor God, that's wisdom. To depart from evil, that's understanding. So it comes not about from our search, it comes not about from prices that are paid, it comes about from paying heed to what God has had to say on the subject. That's why in the churches of Christ we turn to what does the Bible say on every topic, and Solomon covers it all. James, in the New Testament letter, summarizes finally exactly the same idea. But I want you to note what James has to say, the concluding thought here, that James shows us that wisdom is not simply intellectual, it's practical, it's godly and moral, but it goes into action. So who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by his good life, his works, in meekness of wisdom. That's what James tells us. Let him show it. That's where wisdom is to be found. The wisdom that is above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without variance, that means showing no partiality, without variance, without hypocrisy, and the fruit of righteousness is sown, it's what you sow, is sown in peace for them that make peace. Here's a good summary of all that Solomon had to say, and good for us to remember and think about this week as we go forth in our lives. The wisdom that is from above is first pure, peaceable, and gentle. King Solomon's wisdom, the young king's wisdom, good for all of us. The lesson is yours. If you want to come to the front, we'll assist you in any act of obedience that you would like to render as we stand and sing this song of encouragement.